God rest him wherever he is. I know that his wife is working out some sort of an agreement now with the University of Texas.
In 1979, a Navy mechanic named Walter Cade was flying supply runs across the Antarctic interior when his transport was forced down by a failing hydraulic line. What he claims to have seen on that ridge, he carried in silence for over 40 years. This is his story, reconstructed here as fiction, inspired by the enduring mythology of hidden things beneath the ice. Cade was 26 years old the winter his plane went down. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a believer in anything except paychecks and the slow, grinding boredom of polar deployment. He'd signed up for Antarctic duty because the extra pay let him send money home to a sister raising 2 kids alone in Ohio. He had no interest in mysteries. He wanted to finish his rotation and go home. The forced landing happened on a Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday, in a place where the sun didn't set for months at a time. A hydraulic line ruptured some wing over the transantarctic range, and the pilot, a steady-handed veteran named Reyes, brought the plane down hard on a wind-scoured ridge nobody had a name for. The crew spent the first hour doing what crews do, checking for injuries, securing the aircraft, radioing coordinates. Cade's job was to inspect the undercarriage for damage. That's what took him away from the others, out along the exposed rock where the wind had stripped the ice thin enough to see through in places. He always said it wasn't dramatic. That's the detail people didn't expect, and the detail that made his story stick in the minds of the few people he told. He didn't stumble on it, didn't have some cinematic moment of revelation. He was just walking, head down against the wind, and he noticed the ice beneath his boots wasn't opaque anymore. It had a strange clarity to it, glass-like, and beneath that clarity there was a shadow that had no business being there. Straight edges, a corner, the unmistakable geometry of something built rather than something formed. He crouched down and brushed at the surface with his glove. The shadow didn't move or shift the way a rock formation would. It held its lines. Cade said later that his first thought wasn't wonder. It was unease, the kind of primal wrongness a person feels when the world doesn't match its own rules. He called for Reyes. Reyes came, looked, said nothing for a long moment, and then told him to get back to the aircraft. Within the hour, the hydraulic line was patched enough to fly, and the crew was airborne again, and nobody spoke about the ridge. 3 days later, back at the station, Cade was called into an office he'd never been inside before and told, without much explanation, that his flight log for that day would be revised. He signed a form. He never saw the form again. He was told, in the flat, unbothered tone of a man reciting a grocery list, that if he discussed what he saw with anyone, a crewmate, a family member, a reporter, a bartender, there would be consequences that reached beyond his career. He didn't ask what those consequences were. He didn't need to. Cade finished his tour. He came home. He got a job at a machine shop in Dayton and married a woman named Louise who never once heard the story until a year before he died. He kept it locked away with the kind of discipline that only makes sense to people who've been trained to keep secrets, not because he wanted to, but because some part of him believed the warning was real, and some part of him was afraid that saying it out loud would make it more real than it already was. What changed decades later wasn't a crisis of conscience. It was cancer, slow-moving, the kind that gives a person time to think about all the things they never said. In his last year, Cade began writing. Not for publication. He told his daughter it was just so it exists somewhere. He filled 2 notebooks with details, coordinates as best he remembered them, the names of the crew, the layout of the ridge, the exact texture of the ice where it had thinned. He drew a rough sketch of the shadow shape beneath the surface, a shape he said reminded him of a roofline, though he was quick to say he couldn't be sure. He was not a man given to embellishment. If anything, his family said he undersold things his whole life. He never got the chance to send those notebooks anywhere. He died in his sleep on a Thursday in March, and it was his daughter, a woman named Priya, a schoolteacher with no interest in conspiracy and a great deal of interest in her father's peace of mind, who found them in a drawer beneath his old service medals. This is where the story shifts from one man's memory to something larger, and where fiction lets us ask the question real testimony so rarely answers cleanly. What do you do with a secret you didn't ask to inherit? Priya wasn't looking for validation or fame. She wasn't looking for anything, really, except to understand her father a little better after he was gone. She started reading old declassified documents about Antarctic operations from the era her father served, supply manifests, weather logs, the dry bureaucratic residue of a military presence most people never think about. She found nothing that confirmed his story and nothing that disproved it either. Antarctic record-keeping from that period was inconsistent at best, and entire seasons of flight logs had simply been lost to time, water damage, and indifferent archiving. What she did find, almost by accident, was a name in a veterans forum, another man, a radar technician who had served at a different station in a different decade, who mentioned in an offhand post that he'd once tracked an unexplained subsurface anomaly that got flagged, investigated, and then quietly buried in a mountain of unrelated paperwork. Priya reached out. The technician, cautious and elderly, agreed to talk only after months of correspondence, and only under a name that wasn't his own. He didn't know Cade. He'd never heard of him. But his account, stripped of names and specifics, described something eerily similar. A region of ice where radar returns behaved strangely, geometric interference patterns that engineers attributed to equipment malfunction in every official log, and an order from a superior officer to stop flying survey routes over that particular stretch of the continent. He said the order came down without explanation, the way orders in the military often do, and that questioning it would have been a fast way to end a career. Priya began to see the shape of something, not proof, not yet, but a pattern worth taking seriously. She wasn't a journalist. She had no protection, no platform, no institutional backing. What she had was her father's notebooks and a stranger's second-hand memory and a stubborn refusal to let either one disappear without at least being written down properly. She reached out to a documentary researcher, a woman who specialized in oral history projects, someone used to handling fragile, unverifiable testimony with care rather than sensationalism. The researcher's advice was blunt. This isn't a story about proving aliens or lost civilizations. It's a story about what happens to people who see something they can't explain, who are told to be silent about it, and who spend decades carrying that silence like a stone in their chest. That story is true, regardless of what was actually under the ice. The human cost of secrecy, real or imagined, justified or not, is the part that holds up to scrutiny. Priya took that advice seriously. She stopped trying to build a case for extraordinary structures beneath Antarctica and started building something more modest and, in its own way, more honest. An account of a man who saw something strange, was silenced, and spent the rest of his life negotiating the space between duty and truth. Whether the shape under the ice was a rock formation distorted by refraction, an old research cache nobody bothered to document, or something stranger, she couldn't say. Neither could her father. Neither could the radar technician. What she could say, with confidence, was that the fear was real, the silence was real, and the toll it took on the people who carried it was real. She published her father's notebooks, redacted and annotated, through a small university archive that collects oral histories from polar veterans. She didn't sell a documentary. She didn't chase a viral headline. She let the material exist, unresolved, the way most real mysteries actually are, not wrapped up with a bow, not confirmed by some dramatic government slip-up, just sitting there in the historical record for anyone curious enough to look. A few researchers did look. A glaciologist who specializes in ice-penetrating radar reviewed the sketches and said, cautiously, that subsurface anomalies of the kind Cade described are not unheard of: pressure ridges, buried moraine, old crevasse fields refrozen at odd angles, can all produce shapes that look geometric to an untrained eye under the wrong lighting. He was careful to say this wasn't a dismissal, just a reminder that the human mind is extraordinarily good at finding pattern and intention in ambiguous data, especially under stress, cold, and fatigue. He also said, almost as an aside, that Antarctica remains one of the least mapped landmasses on Earth in terms of what lies beneath the ice sheet, and that genuine surprises, geological not extraterrestrial, turn up with some regularity when new radar surveys are conducted. That tension is the heart of this story, fictional as its specifics are: the gap between what a frightened, exhausted young man believes he saw on a ridge in 1979 and what the physical world is actually capable of producing without any hidden hand at all. Priya never resolved that tension, and she said in the one interview she gave about the project that she'd stopped needing to. Her father didn't need the world to confirm his memory, to have lived with the weight of it. He needed someone to believe that the fear was real, that the order to stay silent had actually happened, and that carrying a secret for 40 years leaves a mark on a person whether or not the secret turns out to be extraordinary. If there's a lesson buried in a story like this, it isn't about buried cities or ancient civilizations. It's about the particular loneliness of being told to unsee something, and the strange, quiet relief of finally being allowed to say it out loud, even if the only person listening is a daughter with a box of notebooks and no way to prove any of it. Cade never got to publish his account. He never got to see how it might have been received. But his daughter made sure it existed somewhere outside his own head before it disappeared with him. And in the end, that was the thing he actually wanted. Not vindication, not fame, just for the weight to be shared, even briefly, before it was gone for good. Somewhere in an archive box at a small university library, 2 notebooks sit alongside a scanned interview transcript from a man who asked not to be named. No government has commented on them, because no government needed to. The notebooks were never a threat to anyone, never made headlines, never demanded an answer. They exist quietly, the way most true stories about ordinary people do, waiting for someone curious enough to open a box. Whatever was or wasn't beneath that ridge in 1979 is, in the end, less important than the fact that a young man believed he saw it, believed he was ordered to forget it, and spent a lifetime unable to fully do so. That's a story worth telling on its own terms, not because it proves anything about hidden civilizations, but because it's true to something more universal. The way fear and duty and silence shape a person long after the moment that caused them has faded from the official record, if it was ever on the record at all.